Greetings, everyone. Go ahead and Stefan. For Stefan, we're doing the using building science to inform building envelope. Next slide. I'm Ali Callow Spencer, training development lead for Earth Advantage. I assist Earth Advantage's trainings, programs, curriculum development, and really here to support participants along with any of the inquiries that they have, CE certificates, and also some career development as well. Next slide. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank our partners at Better Built Northwest for generously supporting this training. Go ahead. So here is a screenshot of Better Built Northwest website where you can find a variety of trainings, tools, resources to either support code or above code training, as well as directories that will help you search either by zip code, define an energy rater, utility incentive program, certification program, or other professionals in your area. Overall, Better Built Northwest is an excellent resource, and we encourage you to take a look. Next slide. I'd like to start off by letting people know that this is one of a 3-part series. On the Level is part of Earth Advantage's Sustainable Homes professional course. This session, as well as previously recorded session, really creates the same in-depth experience that you would have received with the in-person SHP class. This class is available now on demand, so we'll go over that in more detail at the end of the session. So now I would like to introduce our instructor, Stefan Aiguier. He's a pioneer in the green building movement. Stefan founded Greenhammer in 2002 and has grown the company to be a full service design build firm known for its commitment to excellence, environmental design, and performance. Within its industry, Greenhammer, a certified B Corp, is known for pushing the envelope and achieving numerous firsts. So the firm was the first certified commercial living building in Oregon. It's a tasting room at Cowhorn Vineyard and Garden, and also Portland's first zero energy neighborhood for seniors at Rose Villa. Greenhammer is currently one of the fewer than 27, now heard 15 firms nationwide meeting the American Institute of Architects 2030 commitment, which is a voluntary initiative to transition the building industry to a carbon-free environment by 2030. Stefan has touched the lives of hundreds of building design professionals through his tenure instructing Earth Advantage's Sustainable Homes professional course. And we're so thankful to have him join us today. Stefan, I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Ali. Really appreciate it. We've got a lot to run through today, so I'm going to kind of just, bolt along. And the whole idea is to get to the end so we can do a lot of question and answer. But really, to get there, we also want to make sure that we review the natural laws that drive thermal, air, and moisture movement and flows through a home, apply that understanding of thermodynamics, and evaluate different enclosures, so building assemblies, to best manage heat, air, and moisture flows, kind of connect those design and material considerations to building a healthy, comfortable, durable, energy efficient home, and select appropriate design features and assemblies according to the project objectives. So that last little bit's really going to be, the cherry on top if we can plow through all this. So I'm going to be moving quickly. If you have questions that pop up, throw them into the chat and we'll get going. So mold and moisture damage, that's kind of, the big worry ever since we started insulating buildings and we've used less and less expensive materials. We end up with more moisture issues. I think a lot of this is a fundamental misunderstanding of just how moisture and bulk water are managed in building envelope and building assemblies. That's why we want to talk about this today. And it has real health risks and costs to people, the people living in buildings, and then greater societal costs if we create sick buildings and we create sick people. So we don't want to do that. Durability issues. Sometimes we aren't always thinking through like, oh, this insulation or ventilation detail is actually causing an ice dam, which is both dangerous, but also is a great way to rapidly deteriorate a building. One quick plug here as we move through, Earth Advantage worked with the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, NEA, to create a fact sheet that gives you a quick summary of the major changes to energy efficiency mechanical chapters in Oregon code. So really recommend that you download a copy of this. We're going to have a link available to you at the end of the presentation. I think Ali should be able to send that out as well. Super handy. There's been a lot of code updates for 2021 that are applicable now in 2022. And this is a great, fun, fast fact sheet. For those of you in Washington and want to take a deeper dive into the Washington Energy Code and Energy Code updates, the WSU's energy program is really your best one-stop shop for trainings, resources, and technical support. Again, we can help share that link as well. All right, so some of this is a real review for you. We try to be quick, but make sure we're comprehensive. First law of thermodynamics, conservation of energy. Energy can be transformed. You can change it from one form to another, but you can't create it, you can't destroy it. It's kind of maybe a nice thing to think about when you're thinking about life in general, but you can transform energy, you can't create it, can't destroy it. It's always there. Second law of thermodynamics. So over time, differences in temperature and pressure and chemical potential, they tend to even out in a physical system. So the heat hit an equilibrium. So these high concentrations, whether it's temperature or chemical or whatever else, moisture, they're going to be in a high concentration. They're going to dissipate and even out. And high pressure always goes to low pressure. So basic principles, warm to cold, more to less, high to low, and gravity. So the last one's important, of course, when you're thinking about ice or water, things falling. But again, really super important. This is all the basis of thermodynamics as far as they really relate to buildings and building science. Cold never comes in, it's warm that goes out. So warm is always kind of chasing cold. High pressure is always trying to move into low pressure. And high concentrations always moving into low concentrations. High moisture content, always trying to go to low moisture content. So we'll talk about the importance of that as we move on. All right, so thermal flows. Again, we can transfer energy. We can't create it, but we can transfer it. We lose a lot of it in the world as low density heat to outer space, right? You heat something, it heats up. It's like, what happened? Well, you know, that fire energy from the wood, well, it's gone now. It's not really gone. That's just kind of floating out as low density heat. It might leave our atmosphere. These days, less of it seems to be leaving. But there are three major modes of heat transfer. There's conduction, so like that touching, right? There's convection, and that would be, you know, airflow and radiation. So let's go over that a bit. So I'm going to go in order of kind of basically impact and importance in a home. So first one is conduction. Now this one is actually pretty important when it comes to how you insulate a home. And thermal conduction is really the movement of heat from direct contact. So one molecule activated or excites heat and transfers that kinetic energy to an adjacent molecule. Insulation is really good at disrupting that transfer. Things like metals are really awesome at facilitating that kinetic energy transfer. And so that image you're seeing with the home, you can see the wood studs, that brighter color, the yellow, is showing that there's a higher conductivity through the wood studs. There's lower conductivity through the insulation. And you see those windows are red. That means there's really high conductivity through the windows. Pretty standard in a home. Now, if those are metal studs, you'd have really bright red studs, essentially. So instead of wood, if you replace that with metal that's really conductive, you're gonna have a lot of heat loss and conductivity. That's one way that we're impacted in a home and from comfort standpoint. Convection, probably the second most important when it comes to home and home comfort. And that's a movement of molecules within fluids. And this, we're really talking about air as the gas. Now, heated air is more buoyant and hot air rises. Heat does not rise. We'll talk about that more when we get to radiant. The heat does not rise. Hot air rises because of a pressure differential on the top and bottom of an air molecule. The warmer air with the excited molecules moving rapidly and with greater energy, they become less dense than cooler air and more buoyant. And so as that hot air you add energy to it, it heats up and it starts to rise. You get these convective flows that can happen. That hot air rises, gets cooled off by the cooler surfaces, comes in low across this diagram, gets heated again, and you get these convective currents. And as that warm air flows around you, you are impacted, you're essentially being heated up. All right, the most important one, actually, that is also the least considered often, is radiation. And I think probably the most obvious form of radiation, of course, is the sun. It's also the most obvious reason why heat moves in all directions. If heat only rose, we'd have a real problem in transferring heat 92 million miles from the sun to planet Earth. It makes that heat transfer is possible through electromagnetic radiation, zipping through outer space, and then hitting our body. So heat energy flows from a high energy body, the sun, to a lower energy body, the Earth, right? It travels in any direction until it strikes that surface of a cooler body and transfers the heat energy. So that can be like a heat radiant panel on a ceiling. It could be, in this case, low on a wall. It can be in a floor. Cool thing about radiant floor systems is that it's both conductive, you're touching it with your feet, right? And it's also heating up at you. But it is also your kind of #1 comfort impact in a home. And we consider that not as much as we should. Here's a little diagram to kind of show what I mean. Been a lot of studies that show that a mean radiant temperature of 65 degrees or higher is really kind of ideal for human comfort. Some of us might get colder easier, maybe at 66, maybe it's even 67. But it's really the mean radiant temperature, much more than the air temperature, that's important. So in this image, we're seeing a person and they're essentially in the middle of a room and they have different temperature surfaces surrounding them. 64-degree floor, 72-degree ceiling, 68-degree wall, 59-degree window. The average radiant experience for that person is 67. They're probably comfortable. You'll notice the thermometer air temperature in this image is 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That's important. So we're like, oh, 70 degrees. It's 70 degrees in here, I'm comfortable. Well, it's actually probably more important that the mean radiant is also above the 65, 66-degree threshold. If we were to add another window to this space, which you can see now is 59 degrees, the coldest surface, what we're going to see suddenly, right? It's like, whoop, guy got cold. Right, so now the mean radiant temperature is down at 63 degrees. Air temperature is still 70, but the person in that room now feels colder. Best way also to think about this, maybe in a grocery store, air temperature across that grocery store is going to be, let's say, 70 degrees. Have a digital thermometer walking through the cereal aisle. You're the heated body, right? Because you're 98 degrees. Everything around you is going to be cooler. You're sending your heat out into those spaces. Cereal aisle, those cereal boxes are probably like the air temperature, maybe 70 degrees. You go through a freezer aisle though, maybe all the doors are closed, nothing's blowing out at you, but you're really cold all of a sudden. And that's because you're dumping your heat into those cold freezers at a much higher rate. And the mean radiant temperature just really plummeted. Air temperature is still 70 degrees, but mean radiant really dropped. It's super important when you think about proximity of windows and also the, how well performing. Like, well, we aren't going to spend the extra money for triple pane. It's really not that important. We're going to put an extra layer of exterior insulation. There's a lot of reasons why that doesn't make sense, especially if that exterior insulation is the same price as a window upgrade. Windows are going to have a huge impact on people's mean radiant temperature experience. If you upgraded these windows, their temperature on the inside surface is going to raise considerably. It's going to have a big impact on people's comfort. All right, moisture flows. Moving on. real fundamentals here, water management or bulk water management we might talk about in the industry is really liquid water. I mean, liquid water, maybe sometimes we're talking about ice. Usually we'll just say that if it's ice. Moisture management is really water vapor, okay? So moisture management, when I say moisture, I mean water vapor. So moisture movement, super important. Liquid water moves by gravity and pressure differences, right? It's usually gonna fall within a building if it gets inside. Ideally, we flash and have good weather barriers and drainage plans so that doesn't happen. Liquid water moves by, can also move by capillary action, so that water is adhesive and it's cohesive. That means it can, in a narrow enough tunnel, a capillary, it can climb. And what we've seen in studies is that water can climb concrete, the pores of concrete, about 1,000 feet. So just because you're above grade and out of the ground, and maybe you've got big eaves covering that concrete, moisture can still like travel up concrete, essentially hundreds of stories, right? So at least when you're talking about homes, multiple stories. So again, really important thing to consider, those capillary breaks for foundations. Water vapor is transported via air movement. So it's really a part of the air. Right now I'm breathing and a lot of H2O is coming out with my breath, right? That's considered part of the overall makeup of air. And water vapor diffuses through building assemblies and building materials. It moves through plywood, it moves through drywall, right? And that's another thing that's super important to understand as we talk about this. Moisture damage. So really buildings, there are two things, fire and water, that really damage buildings. Water is by far the #1 cause for building failures and building damage. There's the freeze-thaw cycles, there's decay, corrosion, and mold that are caused by wood destroying insects and organisms, right? And we'll get to kind of the levels at which those really occur. But essentially, to get wood destroying insect or organism, you have to hit the saturation point for materials. Now, different materials have different saturation points. Certain things that are like a vapor barrier, and we'll get into that in a minute, have no saturation. Basically, they can't absorb any moisture at all. Other things like wood have a pretty high saturation point before wood destroying insects or organisms can be pervasive or prevail. So in Oregon code, we have 19% is what you're allowed to have for your wood framing before an inspector is going to allow you to insulate those walls. There's a really good reason for that, because once you insulate walls, you're going to add a bunch of moisture to the building by putting in drywall, gypsum mud. Then you're going to paint it, tons of hot vapor, right? When you do that, you add a lot of moisture to the building. Plus, there's already a lot of moisture built up in the concrete, and then people and plants and everything else is going to add more moisture. So you want to basically allow the building to have some absorption potential before mold and things could grow. So really, saturation for wood products is about 28%, meaning that once you get beyond 28% pounds of water per pound of wood, you're going to allow for things like, carpenter ants and other stuff are going to love that environment. And you're also going to allow mold and mildew, all kinds of stuff. Fungi is going to love growing in that environment. So really, moisture accumulation is kind of the rate of wetting. So the moisture additions to the building, like, again, plants and showers and people and potentially rain if it's not protected well, minus, the rate of storage. And usually rate of storage is how much storage potential you have plus the drying potential. You have mechanical ventilation systems, windows, doors open, ways that vapor can get out of a building, diffusion rates through a building envelope. So moisture storage capacity, really high storage capacity also means there's often a high drying potential. To have a high moisture storage capacity, you have to be a porous material typically. So you're going to be able to absorb a lot of moisture. That also means if you're absorbing a lot of moisture and it's really dry, becomes really dry out, you can also release that moisture. So remember, high to low. If it's really dry in a space and materials are really moist, it's going to release the moisture. If it's really moist in a space, materials are drier, it's going to absorb it. Now, a 2,000 square foot home is going to have about 45,000 pounds or so of lumber in the building. If you say, okay, well, 28% of that lumber can store moisture before it's becomes a real problem, that's 1,500 gallons of water. Now, when you shut a building up, usually between about 12% and 19% already, you're adding a bunch of moisture. You know, we've done tests and have, you know, run studies on buildings and moisture content sensors. Usually wood is going to settle at around 15% moisture content in a building. But if you say, well, okay, storage of all that wood, it's still safe to store another 5% before we're ever worried about it. Well, that 5% storage capacity is 270 gallons of moisture. Now, that's a lot. And you can basically absorb all of that and release it. So if you're absorbing it all and releasing it, you basically have this really wonderful kind of battery system for storing moisture and releasing it at different cycles when things are dry inside or dry outside. Anyway, cellulose insulation also, like wood, has about a 28% storage capacity. In a typical home, if it was 100% Earth Advantage home, a little bit more insulation, if it's 100% cellulose, you're gonna have about 316 gallons worth of storage capacity with that cellulose of water. If you're saying, well, there's always a little bit of moisture in there, you probably have at least a 25 gallon kind of, you know, at any given moment, it could take another 25 gallons of moisture out of the air. Versus if you used, you know, just like fiberglass, the entire home only has about 25 gallons that it could actually store, period. And all of the fiberglass has a 2% storage capacity. And fiberglass is really hydrophobic. We'll get to that a little bit later. But really, if it can only take on a little bit, that's just a teeny little fraction of moisture. Bulk moisture management. So bulk moisture management, you're really thinking about that water coming in and rain, right? So site work, how you deal at the bottom of this foundation with drainage away from the building, how you're taking rain off of the roof and getting off of the building and away from the building, weather barriers, how you're basically making sure that if water gets behind your cladding systems, why ventilation rain screens are so important. You know, if water gets back there, can it drain off? Because remember, again, water is cohesive and adhesive. If we have what basically we figured out is less than a 3/8 inch gap, it's possible for water to span that gap. Some other studies that show, and maybe it's more like 1/8 of an inch. The bottom line is if you can leave more than a 3/8 inch gap, you're going to create a ventilation cavity and a drying potential behind that siding that you absolutely do not have without a ventilation cavity or what we call a rain screen, which is also shown in this image here with the faux brick. Flashing, drainage, all of that stuff, super important when it comes to bulk moisture management. A lot to cover, we're gonna keep moving on. Another super important thing to consider with your buildings is relative humidity. So relative humidity describes the amount of water that exists in a gaseous mixture of air and water vapor. So water vapor is a part of air, right? So warm air can carry considerably more vapor than cold air. So the amount of vapor in air is considered the absolute humidity, and the relative humidity is how much any particular type of air can store at any given moment. And so if we look at this image, you're seeing like one unit of, you know, 100% relative humidity. It's raining outside, it's 50 degrees, that's 100% relative humidity. You take that air, you bring it inside, you heat it up to 68 degrees. You're expanding that air, there's more capacity, and now you're at 52% relative humidity. Heat up the air to 86 degrees, maybe you're in Florida, the tropics somewhere, now you're down at 28% relative humidity, which is why if you're in the tropics and it's 80% relative humidity, 86 degrees outside, you can store considerably much more moisture. And if it cools down suddenly, you'll get a torrential downfall. So that's at 86 degrees with 100%, that's 4 times the absolute humidity storage down at the 50 degree temperature. So high temperature differences between inside and outside. If it's cold outside, it's highly unlikely there's more, even at 100% relative humidity, that there's more absolute moisture in the cubic foot of air outside than there is in the cubic foot of air inside, right? It's more likely you're going to have those first two images, that kind of dynamic, which means that there's always going to be a pressure drive to the outside. And so if you're in a heating dominated climate, it's all you have to do is it's 45 degrees and raining, and it's, you know, your 50% relative humidity inside, that humidity wants to get out. The bigger the temperature difference, you know, Alaska or really cold at night, the more moisture drive to the outside, right? So when you think about that, the reverse is also true. In the summer, super hot, if it's very humid outside, there's a tremendous amount of moisture drive inside. And so what we really have to think about is that the moisture always wants to move through that assembly. The big question is, should we let it? We'll get to that a little bit more later. I say absolutely, yes. Okay, vapor diffusion. So vapor molecules can travel alone. A water molecule is smaller than other air molecules. So, you know, there's all kinds of nitrogen and oxygen, all kinds of stuff in our air. That two-legged water molecule is like really good at kind of squeezing through stuff, really small pores. Understanding the permeability of your building materials is really, really important. So a vapor will diffuse through any permeable material. We measure permeability in perms. And so again, remember, there's high pressure to low pressure, high concentration to low concentration. And often when in the industry, we talk about air barriers. Most air barriers are like weather resistant barriers. Those are very vapor open. They're hyper vapor open. They're very vapor permeable. They're down at the bottom of this little table, you'll see vapor permeability greater than 10. They're typically at like 40 and up. And so that's a very permeable material, and it's designed specifically to let moisture out of a building. So in a heating dominated climate like Oregon or Idaho or Washington, where most everyone in this call is from, you're going to have vapor trying to leave a building. So it's going out, and that weather barrier is waterproof, vapor open. It's like Gore-Tex. Think of it that way. You have all this vapor coming off your skin. You don't want to be in a sweaty vinyl raincoat. So you've got your Gore-Tex, high performance. It's allowing some of that vapor out. You know, oftentimes like, oh, it's not enough. If you're allowing that vapor out, it's much drier than if you just had your rubber or vinyl raincoat, right? Same thing on a home. If you put a weather barrier that's vapor open, it's going to dry out more quickly. Things like the XPS in that top corner, that's extruded polystyrene. That's going to be typically down at the vapor impermeable level. You're going to have the semi-permeables would be like OSB. OSB is between semi-impermeable and semi-permeable. We'll get to that in a minute. Plywood's basically semi-permeable to permeable. All of these things are important. Insulations are typically hyper-permeable. Very permeable, moisture can move straight on through. All right, air leakage. 30% of the heat loss in a typical home happens through air leakage because homes are very air leaky. So a lot of energy leaves. There's a lot of energy in that vapor too. Water has a really high specific heat. It can hold a ton of energy, more than just dry air. So you're gonna have a lot of moisture transport. That if it hits a cold, moisture hits a cold surface, remember there's condensation. So if you're condensing on exterior sheathing, that can be a real problem if that continues over time, right? And so vapor leaving a building can have about 100 times more impact if there's a 1-inch hole in a diffuse material versus vapor diffusion. So if I were to cut an 1-inch hole through my drywall, the amount of diffusion to the plywood or OSB sheathing through the back is going to be about 100 times higher than if I just allow that vapor to diffuse through that drywall and get to that back sheathing. This is all super important stuff to understand. So again, that's reducing comforts, increasing indoor air pollution. So when you have reverse drives, and it's the #1 cause for ice dams in buildings because you have that rapid release. Remember the 4 big goals of any assembly: control bulk water, control air movement, vapor movement, and thermal movement. So advanced air sealing. There's a lot of different membranes we use for weather barriers on the outside of buildings. Those are typically your best air barriers as well. Tyvek's your most common. Tyvek has their proprietary tapes. Those are pretty good. If you're in like great conditions and perfect installs, you can actually get a pretty tight building with Tyvek. Henry's Blueskin, which is self-adhering, is a little bit better. ProClima, Siga, these German and Swiss respectively. Weather barriers are multiply. They're like 5 layers of Tyvek. They're just much more durable. Their tapes, especially the Siga tapes, are super, super sticky. Siga works even really well when it's pretty wet outside. That's a huge advantage if you're building in the Pacific Northwest. And we have these liquid applied membranes like Prosoco, Tremco, Henry's Blueskin is one, Stowe. Again, these are, Prosoco is a product made regionally. It's also living building compliant. Doesn't have all those red list toxic materials that you need to eliminate to be considered a living building. So it's a really great one. A little bit more laborious to install, but amazing, amazing weather barrier, liquid applied weather barrier. There are different gasket systems for air sealing. Some people just put a foam seal around a window, maybe with spray foam. Some will do a foam backer rod with a sealant, like a caulking that's much tighter. You can definitely get airtight that way. There's also the stuff that's expanding foam tape, like Hanoband. Stuff can be purchased through like 475 or through Small Planet Supply. But yeah, lots of different tapes, membranes, and options for airtight, making a building much more airtight. Window R value. If you really look at this, and we'll be sending, I think, a copy of these slides, but if you really pay attention to the slide, what you'll notice is that as you add more insulation to a building, the U value of your windows, window's ability to resist thermal transfer becomes more and more important. So if you're like, oh, I'm going to take my 2x6 wall, but I'm not going to spend any money on triple pane windows, but I am going to add an inch of exterior insulation. Well, when you price that out, you should price that out against your windows, because it's going to be much more impactful typically to upgrade your windows to triple pane than it will be to add that 1 inch of exterior insulation, if that's what you're looking for. So as you can see here, if you're at an R39 wall system and you put a 0.3 U value window, you're going to have an R15 overall performance of that wall. It's really dragging down the performance. If you put in an R10 or U value 10 window, essentially, your performance at the R39 is R27. Basically double the performance of the window or the whole wall system just by improving your windows. So similarly, again, if you have an R18 wall system, as it gets less and less insulated, you have less impact on the wall values. You get more and more insulated, it has more of an impact. So generally, when you start getting to 2 inches of exterior insulation, make sure you're also looking at, okay, what is the performance of my windows? Because you should probably be investing there first. All right, building materials. I think you should do this basically with all of your envelope assemblies, but I'm going to do this really quick between two that are really important in my eyes from a performance standpoint: oriented strand board and plywood. Now, typically in the past, oriented strand board is less expensive. It's a good use of industrial waste material, but it also has edge swelling when it gets exposed to moisture over time, or even just when you have lots of nails in it. And that edge expansion allows more moisture in. It takes water longer to leave OSB and doesn't return to its original thickness once wetted. OSB also, in a lot of tests, hasn't shown to be airtight. Some products are tighter than others. And there's just more variability in physical properties from one batch and one manufacturer to the next. Plywood has multiple layers, right, that are cross-oriented and perpendicular to each other. There's always odd number of layers. It's a 5-ply, 7-ply, 9-ply plywood. they are airtight by themselves. Of course, you have to tape seams or somehow seal up your seams to make the overall assembly tight, but plywood by itself is considered an airtight material, even with nails through it, because nails are going through a space that wasn't there before. It becomes an airtight connection, but those seams between are not. It's much more resistant to wetting and drying cycles. In fact, as plywood gets more wet, its permeability goes up. It goes from a permeability of 1 to up to around a permeability of 12. Get to that in a second as it gets more wet. And absorbs water faster and releases it faster. You do need higher quality trees to create plywood. Permeability of plywood, again, often between about 10 and 30. But as plywood gets more wet, that's what the graph off to the left is showing, its permeability increases. Its ability to dry out increases, where OSB, it's really stagnant and becomes basically a vapor barrier. And the problem is it finds ways into the OSB. And if it's you have a freeze-thaw cycle, like would be much more rapidly happening in places like Idaho, but also here in Washington and Oregon. Those freeze-thaw cycles really deteriorate OSB rapidly. So if you're in a cold location, much more important. But anytime you want to allow moisture to move through your building envelope and not get stuck and cause mold and damage, then I would definitely suggest plywood. Cellulose versus fiberglass, another good comparison. Cellulose is hydrophilic and it absorbs 28% of moisture. People are like, oh, well, that's bad. Well, it can be bad, but if it's allowed to release that moisture, if there's a rain screen and ventilation cavity, a way for that wall to dry out, then it's going to much more rapidly dry. Where fiberglass is 2%, it's hydrophobic. It doesn't really allow for that more moisture storage, and it has a higher carbon footprint. Cellulose is typically considered carbon negative. There's just a lot of different things. That's much more complex to insulate a whole house with cellulose. I'm just making sure that you understand this because it is an important part of the equation in moisture management in a building. So as you think through all of this stuff, you can start evaluating entire different assemblies. On that top assembly, it's a Larson truss. What that really is a standard framed wall assembly, but then on the outside of the building, you're hanging like an eye joist. And passive house people are doing this and adding cellulose to that outside. Sometimes they're fiberglass. If you add that much cellulose, like a 9-inch eye joist to the outside of your wall assembly, that's a super insulated, low carbon, carbon negative exterior insulation system. Can that store a tremendous amount of moisture and dry out rapidly? Absolutely, especially if you have a ventilated cladding system on the outside. Exterior insulation, it really depends. So if you have foam board on the outside of the building that can have a high global warming potential that is also vapor closed, then you want to have enough on the outside so you don't the more insulation you have on the outside, the warmer that sheathing is on the inside surface. And the warmer the sheathing, the less likely it is going to condensate and create moisture problems. Ideally, use something like a fiberboard or mineral wool, something that can rapidly dry. So if the moisture gets there, it can get out, just like what your weather barrier would allow it to do. Straw bale, hyper vapor open. It's really more about trying to keep the building airtight. Plasters can help you do that by how you seal around different joints. Structurally insulated panels, those are vapor tight, period. So then the seals, you're gonna have that rapid moisture transfer at all the intersections, super critical to detail those really, really well. Again, if you have an OSB panel, you have to think about if there's a lot of moisture exposure and if there's a lot of freeze thaw, what is gonna happen with that panel over time. Double stud walls, you could store a ton of cellulose in there, but what are you using for the exterior sheathing? Now you're super insulated, you're vapor closed OSB. Well, now, there's some vapor transfer, but mostly closed. Now the problem is you're not allowing that vapor to dry out to the outside. It's got to mostly dry to the inside. Cellulose can help be a storage battery. If you're using fiberglass, then you really don't have a lot of storage capacity. You can have a lot of moisture. It's very cold sheathing. There's no exterior insulation, real potential for rot. Insulated concrete forms, that might be two-sided. EPS foam or XPS foam board, that's really vapor closed, no real storage capacity there, a lot of great thermal massing. But you have other products like this Fazwall, Durasol, this chip and concrete and mineral wool block, tremendous amounts of moisture storage capacity, can really be a good battery to allowing moisture transfer back into a building or out, and kind of keep relative humidity. One thing I forgot to mention is that relative humidity is really great between about 35% and 60% for humans. Ideal for human health is 50%. Buildings really want definitely no more than 60%, but ideally 50% or less. And so when you have good moisture batteries in the building, good storage, they tend to balance at that 50% mark pretty well if it's relatively airtight in a heating dominated climate like the Pacific Northwest. If you don't have a lot of storage capacity, your air tends to be a lot drier. Or if you have a really leaky building, it gets considerably dry. Really bad for human health, because that's your first defense mechanism is your mucus. And as you dry out, you become more exposed to viruses and pathogens, blah, blah, blah. So what assemblies would be easiest for you to implement to improve comfort, durability, and performance on your next project? What questions do you have to help determine your best options? What are some of these other considerations? Ease of construction, cost, performance, durability, the tightness. Is it diffuse open? Is it closed? What types of insulation? Why? Let's talk about dew point if you want to bring that up. But what questions do you have to help determine your best options? So I want to open the floor now to some questions if we can do that. And remember, we're going to have a 5-minute interruption and these questions near the end so we can go through some final slides. So do we?
Yep, we do have some questions from Michael Grant. He says, how would you explain pros and cons of vapor open wall assembly versus adding VB to the inside of the wall for Central Oregon? Does code allow either strategy?
Yeah, so code wants a vapor barrier on the inside, so the warm side of a space in a heating dominated climate. And so typically a lot of people are using like a vinyl acetate, vinyl polymer VPA, think acetate on the inside. So a primer that's basically a vapor barrier. And that's not a bad idea for the most part in a heating dominated climate, because what's happening is generally moisture is on the inside and it wants to go out. So you're kind of think of it as traffic, and the traffic's trying to get out, but you're only allowing one car through at a time. And that's coming through maybe different areas, but there's always going to be leaks. So then once it gets past that point, you're basically going through insulation, which is suddenly it's like, 100 lanes. And then you get to plywood, maybe it goes down to 10 lanes. You get to OSB, it goes down to 1 lane. And if you have exterior vapor barrier, like, an XPS, then your wall becomes a parking lot, right? There's no transfer there. And so the question is that sheathing warm enough so it's not going to condense into water? Or is there enough dry air on the inside of the building or drying potential to go back out the way we came if things dry out? But if typically what happens is that you don't want a parking lot if your sheathing gets cold, right? And so a lot of different ways of thinking about this. In German architecture, they're typically going to make sure your vapor barrier, your walls are very diffuse open. And so their assemblies are typically all wood fiber based when you're doing a wood building, so that if moisture gets in that space, it can rapidly dry out. Now, my general approach is, as soon as we have a wall assembly, I want that assembly to be able to dry to the exterior. Always be able to dry to the exterior. Sometimes that can happen in the summer, it can happen in the winter. To meet code, I have my vapor barrier on the inside. I don't like plastic as much because it's typically going to be behind your drywall, and the back of your drywall, that paper is a perfect space for mold. And just a little temperature spike difference at the wrong time of year, you can get mold blooming. Once it's there, it's really hard to get rid of. So I'd much rather it be in the paint. Higher gloss paints are going to have a really high permeability, flat paint's gonna, really vapor impermeable rather. Really flat paints are gonna have a high permeability. Gloss paints, impermeable. Primers, impermeable primers, again, like a vinyl acetate. You also have to think about the toxicity of that. Otherwise, primers are very vapor open. For me, I'm okay with having the paint be my vapor barrier and, basically make the argument to meet code with that. Or if I do have a vapor barrier behind the drywall, I want it to be somewhat vapor open so that it does allow some moisture through, and it's not going to sweat as much on the backside of my drywall. Problem also with plastics, people tend to use it in upside down or backward situations where the plastic is going to be on the face of your studs in a basement, where now the vapor drive is from those concrete walls in. It's 100% relative humidity on the other side, and there's a lot of vapor drive always. It's going to be trying to come in, hit the plastic, suddenly you're rotting that framing. So for me, I like diffuse open. I like the ventilation cavities, and from multiple studies, we've seen diffuse open assemblies work really, really well. Where you have problems is when you interrupt those diffuse opens with materials that aren't, right? Like oriented strand board or thin layers of XPS, because that stops your moisture transfer.
Perfect. We have time for just one more question. Please, every one of you, if you would like, put your questions into Q&A, and we'll be able to get it in our optional Q&A from 1 to 1:30. So the next question that came in was from Paul Dobbs that said, what would you recommend for the best exterior insulation option for the Northwest with a rain screen system?
From a low carbon standpoint, I love wood fiber. Wood fiber board it's a fantastic option just because it's made with like a paraffin wax mixed into the fibers. So it is essentially, it's kind of this cool thing where it's a little bit hydrophobic, but it has storage capacity all at the same time. So it's not absorbing the water, but it's allowing it to transfer through, and it has some storage capacity. So it's essentially like little waterproof strands of wood. You do need to cover those up. You don't want to leave them out for a full winter or even months in the rain, but you put your weather barrier on the outside of the wood fiber. But it's a carbon neutral negative, all, can be domestically made. There is going to be a domestic partner in the next 2 or 3 years, I've heard, making wood fiber products here in the West Coast. There's some already being made on the East Coast. And it is really a great product. Otherwise, mineral wool would be my next favorite. Again, rapidly drying, fireproof material. There's some studies that show actually the wood fiber, because its density also is resistant to fire. But it's also great from, you don't have to worry about it getting wet. And so that's another really great material. After that, I like graphite impregnated EPS, lower global warming potential relative than the other foam boards, a little bit higher insulation value. So that's the gray kind of EPS, otherwise the white EPS. And the one I like the least, although they're getting some new low carbon blowing agents, would be XPS. And so there are some new products coming online, but you have to make sure you're asking for it. And everyone in the supply chain needs to know that's what you're getting. And as you know, supply chains can be really confusing. I see another question. I just want to answer it really quick. Keep in mind, when I talk about storage capacity, I'm always talking about pounds of water relative to pounds of weight of material. So cellulose is installed in 3.5 pounds per cubic foot. That means it can store about 1 pound of water per cubic foot of cellulose installed. Same goes for the wood.
We're going to go ahead and do closing statements. The next session will be an optional Q&A. So while I finish up final statements, please feel free to put it in the Q&A session versus the chat. So go ahead and do next slide, Stefan.
Yep. The other thing I'd say is there'll be this Q&A after. So if you can stay, I'll answer more questions after the session.
Perfect. So as mentioned, the On the Level series is just one of the many features with SHP. Go ahead and next slide. So we have been offering the SHP course and credentials for over 10 years to professionals across the state and nation who've attended this course to take their project to the next high performance level and sustainability. So we're now happy to offer this course online. It used to be a full 12-day session that was spread over 6 months and was quite the time commitment. So, and because of in person, we were also limited to where we could offer it as well. Go ahead and hit the tab. So we are pleased to list that this is now accessible regardless of your location. It consists of 15 hours of core content with features such as professionally filmed site visits, product demos. Last year's On the Level webinars were also there as well. I'll make that available to you in the chat. But you also get live sessions with our instructors with the fill in the gap tutorials and more. Go ahead, next slide. So just to go over pricing, this is one of the more robust programs that you're going to find across the nation. Registration is $600. We do have discounts for affordable housing providers. Also, if you're an Earth Advantage professional, we do have a $100 discount as well as a $50 discount for groups or more. Stefan, go ahead.